I'm Warren, he's Charlie. I can see, he can hear, that's why we work together. Have trouble remembering each other's names from time to time. We have a few slides that deal with the first quarter earnings. I think Mark Hamburg would like me to emphasize that these are preliminary. This is about as early as we ever have a meeting in relation to the quarter. Normally it's always the first Saturday in May. So they had to work a little harder than usual to get these numbers together. And I would tell you as background that basically pretty much all of our businesses, with the exception of those that are related to residential housing, are getting better. And you can almost see it with most of them quarter by quarter. We have a wide diversity of businesses. We have more than 70 companies we list, but then Marmon itself has over 100 businesses. So we are a cross-section of not only the American economy, but to some extent we see a fair amount about what's going on internationally too. And in the first quarter, as has been the case really since the fall of 2009, both our non-residential construction businesses, except for those non-residential construction businesses, our other businesses have generally gotten better quarter by quarter, and there was no exception to that in the first quarter. What was very different in the first quarter was that we had probably the second worst quarter for the insurance industry in terms of catastrophes around the globe. Normally, the third quarter of the year is the worst period because that's when hurricanes tend to hit the U.S., with most of them, about 50% of them occurring in September and then sort of forming a normal curve on either side of September. So the third quarter usually is the record quarter. And the third quarter was the record quarter back at the time of Katrina. But in the first quarter of this year, we had some major catastrophes in the Pacific, Asian areas, and that hit the reinsurance industry particularly hard. No one knows at this point. I mean, it's a wild guess, but probably those catastrophes cost the reinsurance industry on the order of $50 billion. And we usually participate to the extent of 3 to 5%. First of all, I'll give you our overall earnings, the way we normally present them. And if we'll put the first slide up, you can see that our insurance underwriting suffered an after-tax loss of $821 million. Now, when I wrote the annual report, I postulated normal earning power of Berkshire at about $17 billion pre-tax and about $12 billion after-tax, assuming break even on insurance underwriting. Our insurance underwriting has done better than break even. In fact, it's made quite a bit of money for 8 consecutive years. But I would say with the start of these catastrophes in the first quarter, or the catastrophe experience we had in the first quarter, I would say that it's unlikely that we would have an underwriting profit for 2011. If it was remarkably catastrophe-free from this point forward, including hurricanes in the United States, it's conceivable we would break even or make a tiny profit. But that's an improbable assumption. So I think for the first time in 9 years, we will likely have an insurance underwriting loss this year. I think our record may very well be quite a bit better than certainly most other reinsurers, and it does not change my expectation that over time our insurance underwriting should at least break even. And if you have followed what I've written in the annual reports, if insurance breaks even, we get the free. What I've written in the annual reports, if insurance breaks even, we get the free use of float, and the use of float, and that's been enormously valuable in the past, and I would expect it to be in the future. And if you look at the other lines, insurance investment income's down a little. That will go down more because our Goldman Sachs preferred was called in April. Our General Electric preferred is almost certain to be called in October. So we have lost, and we had called a note from Swiss Re that was paying us 12% and came to something over $360 million a year when the Swiss franc went above par. So we have lost, or are losing, at least 3 very high yield investments which we cannot replace with cash, and that does not count the $5.5 billion that we were going to receive in April from our Goldman Sachs preferred. So that money is earning virtually nothing now, and I would not expect that to be part of the long-term picture either. So there would, just a few percent on that would be many, many hundreds of millions of dollars. So I think over time, our insurance investment income, even though it will dip throughout this year, I would expect that if we have a similar level of investments to actually grow from the level we show here. We had the full ownership of BNSF in the quarter this year. We only had it, I think, from February 12th last year. So that in significant way accounts for the gain in that next line of railroad, utilities, and energy. But the BNSF also had a significant gain in earnings, and the railroad business looks to me like it will have a very good year this year. Not just our railroad, but all railroads. And the competitive advantage of railroads is becoming more and more evident almost by the day, particularly as fuel prices increase. And in the remaining lines, we also had gains in most of our businesses. So overall, we got hit very hard in the insurance business. And if we'll move to slide 2, we list the 3 major catastrophes that occurred, which in aggregate we estimate we have a total loss of $1,673,000,000 pre-tax. And that figure, as with all early estimates about major catastrophes, is subject to a lot of change. Nobody knows what the insured losses will be from the Japanese earthquake. But this is our best estimate now. You'll notice that over 40% of the underwriting loss comes from a contract we have with Swiss Re, where we get 20% of their business. That contract is in the 4th of its 5 years. They have indicated that they will not be interested in renewing it. I just wish they'd told us that a few months ago. But we've enjoyed the relationship with Swiss Re. It's just that we enjoy it some quarters more than others. And our estimate, we've added a little something into their estimate because on balance we feel that most catastrophe losses develop upward. It's sort of the nature of the business. But that, incidentally, the tornadoes in April, just at GEICO, we expect, and all we're talking about is automobiles here, cars, because we don't insure the homeowners. We act as agent in placing insurance for people, but we do not take the insurance risk. We estimate that 25,000 cars will get automobile claims. That's a lot of automobiles when you think about it. Our market share is about 9%, although it varies by state. But it's been an extraordinary tornado season, as you know. That does not hit. I do not believe that hits the reinsurance business particularly hard because there are multiple events. but no one event is anything like, say, the New Zealand earthquake. The New Zealand earthquake estimated at $12 billion of insured damage. Charlie, how many people are in New Zealand?
Well,
we don't practice these things, as will become evident here.
What, about 3 million? 3 million? I'd guess a little more than that. 4? 5, maybe.
5, okay, 5 million people. So that's 1/60th of the population, we'll say, of the United States. And if you take 12 billion and multiply it by 60, you come up with 720 billion, which is 10 times Katrina in terms of the impact on a place like that. So there's been some really extraordinary earthquakes, and as I say, the worst part of the season is, generally speaking, for reinsurers, is yet to come. So this may be a year that the reinsurers will remember, although they might prefer to forget it. There's some good news on the insurance front. On the next slide, I show the growth in policies at GEICO month by month this year versus last year. Now, if you'll remember, in the annual report, I gave an explanation in talking about goodwill value, about how the goodwill of GEICO is carried on our books at about $1 billion. And no matter how successful the business becomes, that goodwill value is never increased on the books, but it does grow. And as I put in the annual report, I estimate its value currently, using the same sort of yardstick we used when we purchased the second half of the company back in 1995. I estimate that value has grown maybe to 14 billion. I mean, every policyholder at GEICO, on average, has a value to us, the way I calculate it, of something on the order of $1,500. And when we add 318,000, and as of yesterday it was up to 381,000, when we add that, we've added something approaching $500 million to the goodwill value. That does not count the earnings from underwriting, which were substantial for GEICO. That does not count the investment income from the float. It does not count the investment income from the net worth we have attributed to it. That is added goodwill value, the same sort of goodwill value that a Coca-Cola has, or a Mars has, or any company like that. And people think of it differently when they think of most consumer products. But a policyholder to Berkshire at GEICO has very, very significant value. There's a very significant percentage have been there for 10 years or more, and it's something that we do not realize on our balance sheet or income account, but it's an asset that's every bit as real as the numbers that we do put on the balance sheet. So there's good news at GEICO. We are gaining market share every day. As a matter of fact, if you think about it, we have some people in the adjacent room that will be glad to sell you GEICO policies. And if only 66 of you sign up, that's a goodwill value of about $100,000. So it will take care of some of the expenses of this meeting. Not that I care whether you do it or not. Now, there's one more item I want to go through on the earnings picture, just because it's been selling at, say, 80% of X for quite a while. Nobody knows exactly what quite a while means, and I'm sure they phrase it differently in the accounting textbooks. But anyway, if it sells there for quite a while, you're supposed to mark it down to that new valuation and have that markdown go through your income account, through your profit and loss account. Now, we mark it down in any event for the balance sheet, and the balance sheet is what gives you the number for book value and is our reference point. But only when it meets this other than temporary thing does the markdown actually get run through the profit and loss account. Now, on March 31st, as is shown, I believe, on the next slide, we owned some Wells Fargo stock, which had a cost of about $8 billion, and the market value was $11.3 billion. But some of the Wells Fargo stock we bought had been bought at higher prices than the March 31st figure, whereas, as you can see, a lot of the stock, which had a gain in it of $3.7 billion, had been bought at lower prices. Well, under the rules, we were required to mark down the stock we bought at a higher price by $337 million, whereas we ignored in the income account the $3.7 billion of gain. Now, interestingly enough, there's two ways you can account for securities, as I understand it, both fully meeting GAAP accounting requirements. And if we had used the average cost method, we would not have had to mark down, but we used what they call the specific identification method. Now, the specific identification method is actually useful to us from a tax standpoint, because it means whenever we sell a security, we can pick out the highest priced security and attribute the sale to that. So it actually saves us money, or the time use of money, to get into specific identification. But we could just as easily use the average cost method, and then we would not have a write-down like we have. And that's why one of the reasons I emphasize that the fact that you should ignore gains or losses in securities or derivatives on a quarterly basis or even an annual basis. The important thing is what the operating earnings of our businesses are doing and what the gain in book value generally has been. And then on top of that, you have to make your own estimate for what intrinsic value is, which would include things like the value that has been developed at GEICO. I apologize for taking you through the accounting lessons, but the headlines often just say what the final net income is, as if that's the all-important figure, and sometimes it's the all-deceptive figure. I mean, it really bears, if you include gains and losses, it bears really no connection to the reality of whether a quarter has been satisfactory from our standpoint. But it does get a lot of attention in the press, and that's why we spend perhaps an inordinate amount of time trying to explain what really takes place in our financials. Now, I think we're going to get to the questions and answers here in just a second. We'll alternate between the press group on my right and 13 stations microphones that have been placed, I think a dozen of them in this room and maybe one in one of the overflow rooms. I'd like to just comment for a few minutes, and this will be transcribed and up on the internet at our webpage. I'd like to comment for just a few minutes, and I'd like to ask Charlie then to give his thoughts on the matter of David Sokol and the purchase of Lubrizol stock. You saw in the movie a clip from the Solomon situation, and that occurred almost 20 years ago. It'll be 20 years ago this August. And at the time, there was a Sunday. Charlie was there, and I was elected the chairman at, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon or so, I think, on a Sunday at Solomon. And I went down to address a press group, and almost the first, somewhere in the early questions, somebody sort of asked me, what happened? And well, I'd just gotten to Solomon fairly recently, so I didn't know too much about it. But the phrase that came out of my mouth then, sometimes my mind and my mouth are coordinated. The phrase that came out of my mouth then was that what had happened was inexplicable and inexcusable. Now it's 20 years later, and looking back on Solomon, I still find what happened inexplicable and inexcusable. I will never understand exactly why some of the events that transpired did transpire. And to some extent, in looking at what happened a few months ago with Dave Sokol's failure to notify me at all that he'd had any kind of contact with Citigroup. In fact, he directed my attention to the fact that they represented Lubrizol and never said a word about any contact with them. And then the purchases of stock immediately prior to recommending Lubrizol to Berkshire, I think for reasons that are laid out in the audit committee report, which I urge you to read and which is on our website, I don't think there's any question about the inexcusable part that Dave violated, in that the code of ethics. He violated our insider trading rules, and he violated the principles I laid out. I lay out every 2 years in a direct personal letter to all of our managers, and which I've been doing for a long time. So you can read the audit committee report about that. The inexplicable part is somewhat, well, it's inexplicable, but I'd like to talk about it a little bit, because I will tell you what goes through my mind in respect to it. Certainly, well, one interesting point is that Dave, to my knowledge at least, made no attempt to disguise the fact that he was buying the stock. I mean, you read about insider trading cases, and people set up trusts in Luxembourg, or they use neighbors who know neighbors, or they use third cousins, or they have various ways of trying to buy the stock, so that when it's later that FINRA, as a supervising organization, looks at the trading activity in the months prior to a deal, they do not see names that jump out at them as being associated with the deal. As to my knowledge, Dave did nothing like that. So he was leaving a total record as to his purchases. Now, I think at least usually, and maybe always, we are queried after any deal. We are asked who knew about it when. And we supply a list of whether it's people at the law firm or people that are in a secretarial position at our place or the law firm. We give them a list of everybody that might have known or did know about the deal prior to the public announcement. And I don't know whether they do that 100% of the time, but certainly it's my experience that you get that. And then a while later, you get a list of names of people that FINRA, again, has picked up as trading it, and they ask you whether any of those names ring a bell with you. So they're trying to put together whether anybody did any inside trading ahead of time. So the odds that if you're trading in your own name and you're on that list of people who know of a deal ahead of time, the odds that it's not going to get picked up seem to me that are very much against you. But to my knowledge, Dave did not disguise the trading, which, that's somewhat inexplicable that if he really felt he was engaging in insider trading and that knew the penalties that could be attached to it, that he essentially did it right out in the open. So, a second fact, which is perhaps less puzzling, but Dave obviously has a net worth in very high numbers. He made, I think, close to $24 million. He earned it from Berkshire last year, and we got our money's worth. But he did get $24 million too. So I would say that there are plenty of activities in this world that are unsavory, that are committed by people with lots of money. So I don't regard that as totally puzzling. But I will give you one instance that does make it puzzling. It makes it very puzzling to me. We bought Mid-American at the end. Berkshire Hathaway bought Mid-American at the end of 1999. Berkshire Hathaway bought about 80%. Walter Scott, who I just introduced, in his family was the second largest holder, I think something over 10%. And then two operating people, Dave Sokol, the senior one, owned or had options on a big piece, and Greg Abel, a terrific partner of Dave's, also had a piece. And Walter Scott, and I've told this story privately a few times, but I don't think I've done it publicly. Walter Scott came to me a year or two after we'd bought it, and Walter said, I think we ought to have some special compensation arrangement for Dave and Greg if they perform in a really outstanding manner. And he said, I think maybe he suggested something involving equity, and he saw me turn white. So he said, why don't you design one and let me know? So I just scribbled something out on a yellow pad. It didn't take me 5 minutes. And we called it, sort of in honor of Charlie, although he didn't know about it, we called it the Lollapalooza. And it provided for a very large cash payout, which I'll get to in a second, based on the 5-year compounded gain in earnings. And we were starting from a high base. In other words, this was not from any depressed level. And we set a figure that no other utility company in the United States was going to come close to. But if that figure were achieved, we were going to give $50 million to Dave and $25 million to Greg Abel. And I had Dave come to the office, and I said, here's what Walter and I are thinking, and what do you think of this plan? And it had these figures on per share that, like I say, move forward at 16% compounded per year. And then I said, here's the payout. And he looked at it for just a very short period of time. And he said, Warren, this is more than generous. But he said, there's just one change you should make. And I said, what's that? And he said, you should split it equally between me and Greg. Instead of being $50 million for me and $25 for Greg, it should be 37.5 apiece. So I witnessed, and Walter witnessed, and he talked to him about it. We witnessed Dave voluntarily, without any, Greg had nothing to do with it. He wasn't there. We saw Dave transfer over $12.5 million, getting no fanfare, no credit whatsoever, to his, in effect, junior partner. And I thought that was rather extraordinary. And what really makes it extraordinary is that $3 million, 10 or so years later, would have led to the kind of troubles that it's led to. I find that is really the fact that I find inexplicable, and I think I'll probably, it's 20 years after Solomon. If 20 years from now, Charlie will be 107, and we won't mention what I'll be. But I think 20 years from now, I will not understand what causes a man to voluntarily turn away $12.5 million to an associate without getting any credit for it in the world, and then 10 or so years later, buy a significant amount of stock a week before he talked to me. And when he talked to me about Lubrizol, it was either the 14th or 15th. He says it was 14th, and I have no reason to disagree with that. The only reason I couldn't say specifically was I had 8 university groups, 160 students in on that Friday. That's the only thing shows, and I spent most of the day with them. And the 10K and the 10Q that got printed out on Saturday have that date on them, the 15th, when I looked at Lubrizol for the first time. Might be interested in knowing. I've been looking up 10Ks and 10Qs for 20 or 30 years, but I don't know how to print them out. So fortunately, Tracy Britt was in the office, and I said, Tracy, would you print this damn thing out? I don't know how to do it yet. But that is why I don't know whether it's the 14th or the 15th. The 10Q says the 15th. But at that time, when Dave called me on it, he said nothing about contact with Citigroup or anything of the sort. And I said, I don't know anything really about the company. He said, well, take a look at it. It might fit Berkshire. And I said, well, how come? And he said, well, and he said, I've owned it, and it's a good company. It's a Berkshire type company. And I obviously made a big mistake by not saying, well, when did you buy it? But I think if somebody says I've owned the stock, it sounds to me like they didn't buy it the previous week. So there we are with a situation which is sad for Berkshire, sad for Dave, still inexplicable in my mind, and we will undoubtedly get more questions on it. We'll be glad to answer them. Charlie, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I think it's generally a mistake to assume that rationality is going to be perfect, even in very able people. We prove that pretty well, regularly.
Do you have any explanation for the irrational?
Yeah, I think hubris contributes to it.
Well, we've gotten quite a bit out of them, folks. Okay, let's go to work.